The next session is on promoting ethical decision-making in research, and this speaker is joining us online. He is David B. Resnik, a bioethicist at the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences and senior advisor for research integrity to the Office of Intramural Research at the National Institute of Health. Yes, Dr. Resnik has published over 300 articles and 10 books on various topics on ethical, philosophical, and legal issues in science, technology, and medicine. He is a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. He serves on several editorial boards and is an associate editor of the journal Accountability in Research. Ladies and gentlemen, EXCEL-RITE Conference, please let's make welcome Dr. David B. Resnik. Please a round of applause for him. So David, I can see you. Yes, great. You have slides you want to put up?
I can't see you very well. I can't see you at all, but I can see my screen. So I'm going to start presenting this. So I am honored to speak today. Thank you for asking me to participate in this important conference. I'm going to talk a little bit about ethical decision-making in research today. The ideas and opinions are supported by the NIEHS, my research is, but it doesn't reflect the views of the NIEHS or NIH necessarily. So we start about just very basics here. What is responsible conduct of research? Well, it's following the ethical, legal, and professional standards for the conduct of research, that is following the rules, but also making ethical decisions when the rules and guidelines, policies do not, when they conflict or they do not provide clear guidance. And we'll see situations like that. It's doing the right thing for the right reason. And it's also about developing good character traits, becoming a good person, developing traits like honesty, integrity, accountability, and so on in your person. So there are a lot of topics that are relevant to the responsible conduct of research. We're not going to cover hardly any of these today, but just want to give you an idea of what's there and what we teach at the NIH and what a lot of other universities teach. Things like research misconduct, data fabrication, falsification, plagiarism, and the difference between that and questionable research practices, data management, record keeping, storage, ownership, sharing of data, reproducibility and rigor, authorship, publication, peer review issues, conflict of interest, intellectual property, the research environment, things like good mentoring and safety in the environment and not having harassment or discrimination, animal research. Yeah.
Dr. Resnik.
Here.
Are you seeing these slides?
Yes, we can see it, but it's not yet in presentation mode and it's not advancing as you speak.
Okay. Hold on a second. Do you see that slide? Okay, you see the beginning slide? This is what I talked about on what responsible conduct of research is. These are the different topics. That's where I was when we just stopped for a second. So there are a lot of topics, as you can see, things like social responsibility too, dual use research that could be used for good or bad purposes like gain of function research and virology, interactions with the public and the media, politics, research funding, emerging topics like artificial intelligence, big data, genome editing, synthetic biology, nanotechnology. So there's a lot of topics that can come up under responsible conduct of research. Now, why is this important? Well, I think there's several reasons. First of all, just to obtain the goals of research, if you want to get knowledge, which I take it that's what we're all here to do, then lying is generally not a good way to get there. Being transparent is not being transparent, or transparency helps you get to knowledge. Openness, sharing information, that all helps you get to the goal of knowledge development. But it's also important for having a ethical, productive, collaborative, and fair research environment, or what we might call a culture of integrity. So you think about things like authorship on scientific papers. You think about personal relationships in the laboratory, and not having an environment where there's no harassment or discrimination, things like that. All of that is important for having a good research environment. And it's also important for getting public trust and support. We depend so much on the public for funding, but support more generally. Oops. Yeah. So let me talk. These are some of the norms for scientific research. I'm not going to cover them all today, but we'll look at how some of them play out in a few cases. Things like honesty, rigor, objectivity, openness, transparency, reproducibility, carefulness, freedom of expression, thought and inquiry, sharing credit fairly, confidentiality, that is for things that should be kept confidential, like personnel information or data that's not ready to be published, safety, respect for intellectual property, protection of human and animal subjects, efficient use of resources. These sort of general principles or norms are just sort of, they're ethical, they're cross-cutting, they're very general things that people accept as part of doing good science. But you usually find these things, you find a lot of them sort of expressed in different rules. So you have academic institutions have rules. Some examples here from Duke University, one from NIH. So there's policies for research at those universities. You also have journals and journal associations with their policies. They'll have things like policies on authorship, policies on peer review and publication, and conflict of interest disclosure. Funding agencies have policies. Regulatory agencies, like in the United States, the Food and Drug Administration, they have policies. You have policies from professional societies and also international research organizations like the World Medical Association and the World Conference on Research Integrity. So if you look at this sort of big picture here of what's going on, you have at the top, you have those three parts that are so important for the foundation: the ethical research environment, the goals of science, and public trust and accountability. Those give rise to or justify the norms of science. And then those you find expressed in things like more specific policies, regulations, guidelines. And then eventually that all gets down to the most important thing is having actual ethical practices and behavior. So what is ethical decision making? Well, it's making a decision based on sound ethical principles, guidelines, or values, and following through with that decision, that is acting with integrity. Sometimes, most of the time actually, there is very little uncertainty. There's just, you don't have much of a question about what to do. Like if someone's asking you, should I fake data? And you're like, no, there's no reason to fake. You don't need to fake data. It's just clear that's something you shouldn't do. Or someone's going to just violate a rule for research with human subjects, and it's clear that that's not what you're supposed to do. So there's no question that there's no conflict. There's nothing uncertain about it. You just do the right thing. But there are situations, however, when there is ethical uncertainty, because you're uncertain about maybe the facts or the circumstances related to the case. Maybe you're uncertain about how to interpret the principles, guidelines, or values. And maybe you're uncertain about how to resolve conflicts among principles or values, or maybe all of that, right? So if you're faced with a situation like this is how I would sort of recommend what you try to do, just to sort of a method for doing this. And this is nothing that's unique to me. A lot of other people have talked about following a method like this. The first thing to do is to identify the problem or question or issue that you have to deal with. The next thing is to gather the relevant information. Lots of decisions are made because bad decisions are made because people don't have all the information they need. Then explore your feasible options, things that you could do in the situation. Then apply the principles, guidelines, or laws or policies and so on to the situation, and they telling you what option you should do according to those rules. And then resolve conflicts if there are any. Now, there are some things to think about when sort of putting this all together and making a decision. And these, you see this actually sort of in moral theories and things like that. They sort of express things like this. First thing I would ask you to think about when you're making a decision is, can I publicly defend my decision? And so you think about it, what would it look like if people found out about I made this decision? What would my boss say? What would the newspaper say? If it's public, so being able to publicly defend what you're doing is very important for ethics. Also, for yourself, can I live with this decision, right? So you make an ethical decision and you're thinking to yourself, did I really do the right thing? Am I going to be up at night, not being able to sleep because I think I did the wrong thing, right? So it's very important to be able to live with yourself and feel like you're living a good life. What are the likely consequences of this decision? Like, think of all the people affected by your decision. Does the good outweigh the bad? That's sort of a utilitarian way of looking at it. Am I making a choice based on selfishness, ego, fear, revenge, or malice? Or am I acting out of a sense of moral duty or responsibility? I think that's always another thing to help you as a guide here, is to check your motives. And this is sort of more of a Kantian approach to it. And very similar to that, a Kantian sort of view is, what if everybody did this? So let's look at some cases then. First of all, I want to give some background to this first case. Research misconduct is behavior that is widely regarded as seriously unethical in research. Questionable research practices are behaviors that are ethically suspect, but not widely regarded as seriously unethical. So if you sort of think of it like a, shall we say, sort of a line, or, some kind of thing where you have one thing fading into the other. On the left hand, you have what we would consider misconduct, the left-hand side of this page, data fabrication and falsification. On the right hand, there's ethical research, honest, unbiased, rigorous, and transparent collecting, reporting, analyzing, and interpreting and reporting of data and images. In the middle, you have things that are questionable and could be research misconduct depending on what happens. So, suppression of data, p-hacking and other questionable uses of statistics, careless preparation and selection of digital images, overstating the significance of your results, refusing to share data or materials after publication. On the left-hand side, we have plagiarism. On the right-hand side, we have what's ethical, appropriate citation and authorship attribution. And in somewhere in between there, you have things like inappropriate authorship, inappropriate reuse or of your own text, or what's sometimes called self-plagiarism. And we have some other things in here that we would call questionable research practices, like good supervision or mentoring, poor supervision or mentoring, or mismanagement of conflict of interest. There are also things that are misconduct. They're widely regarded as seriously unethical, but they're not unique to research, so we don't really consider them research misconduct. So sexual and other harassment, bullying, inappropriate personal relationships, discrimination based on gender, sex, sexual orientation, race, things like that, financial fraud, mismanagement of funds. These are all, very bad. You don't do them, but they're not really usually defined as research misconduct. So research misconduct, according to the U.S. federal definition, which is used by all federal agencies, most U.S. universities, and actually most countries in the world have something like this as part of their definition of research misconduct. There's a lot of countries go beyond this, but they have this as sort of like the minimal thing, the bottom line, the bare minimum that you would have for calling something misconduct. Research misconduct means fabrication, falsification, or plagiarism in proposing, performing, or reviewing research, or in reporting research results. It does not include honest error or differences of opinion. So fabrication is making up data or results or recording and reporting them. Falsification is manipulating research materials, equipment, or processes, or changing or omitting data or results such that the research is not accurately represented in the research record. And plagiarism is the appropriation of another person's ideas, processes, results, or words without giving appropriate credit. Under U.S. law, for there to be a finding of misconduct, there must be some other things that must be found. There must be a significant departure from accepted practices of the relevant community. There must be a finding that it was committed intentionally, knowingly, or recklessly. That is kind of what was already said earlier. It was not an honest mistake. And the allegation must be proven by preponderance of evidence, which for the purposes of, say, NIH funding, that would be administrative law, or say if you're getting fired by your university, that's contract law. So it just means that it's more likely than not that you did it, which is a lower standard of evidence than criminal law, which in U.S., at least in many countries, is beyond reasonable doubt. So let's look at this case to give you an illustration of this method for making decisions. Ms. Smith is a graduate student working on the direction of Dr. Draper, a senior investigator and pharmacologist who has a great deal of influence at the university. Dr. Draper is a consultant for Big Pharma, a company that sponsors his research on cholesterol-lowering drugs. He holds patents on several genetic tests that can help guide drug therapy. Ms. Smith attends a departmental seminar in which Dr. Draper discusses their latest findings on genetic variants that affect the metabolism of a drug developed by Big Pharma. To her surprise, Ms. Smith notices that Dr. Draper has omitted data from 3 of the experiments that she conducted on metabolism of this drug, but he does not explain why. Omitting the data significantly strengthens empirical support for Dr. Draper's hypothesis. After the talk, Ms. Smith asked Dr. Draper why he omitted the data from her experiments, but he brushes her off. She approaches him the next day about the experiments. We don't need to discuss this further, do we? Okay, so this is a situation in which it seems like something unethical may be going on here, right? You're worried that maybe Dr. Draper has falsified data, right? Manipulated the data. So that would be your question, basically. What should I do? Has he falsified data, and what should I do about it? Those are your big questions. But you should be looking for relevant facts as well. So ask yourself, if you're putting yourself in Ms. Smith's position, what are the relevant facts? Well, it seems like you need more facts as to whether she did do these experiments correctly. Now, she could find that out by maybe talking to Dr. Draper more. Maybe he'd be willing to talk to her more about that. They could go over the experiments. Maybe she could talk to another student or a postdoc or someone else in the department. But the first thing you really want to find out is, whether these experiments were done properly or not. And if they were done, if they weren't done properly, then that could be a completely valid reason for excluding the data. The data are just not valid, right? So you don't want to make a misconduct allegation against Dr. Draper, if it turns out that there was a very legitimate reason for not including the data. So what are the options available for Ms. Smith? Well, she could talk to Dr. Draper about this. He's not been very approachable, but maybe he was just busy. Maybe he could talk to her about it. I mean, a lot of times that's really the best thing to do, is just to try to handle things internally before going outside. But if he's not willing to talk, or the conversation seems to be going nowhere, that's when Ms. Smith could think about talking to some other people, maybe the department chair or department head, a dean, somebody at the institute that deals with research integrity and research compliance and ethics issues. That she could talk to someone about these things. Maybe at some point she would even make a research misconduct allegation against Dr. Draper. I don't know, but that kind of depends on what she would learn and how the conversations would go. What are the applicable rules or policies? Well, hopefully her institution has rules for research misconduct that I mentioned earlier, rules that prohibit, say, data fabrication or falsification, that make that, unethical, a violation of university policy. Maybe this is research funded by the NIH or another funding agency, and so those are other rules. There are rules about that as well. She should also be aware, hopefully, maybe knows about some rules that protect whistleblowers. Most institutions have rules that protect you from retaliation if you report illegal or unethical behavior or something at work. So that's important to know about those too. So putting all this together then at the end of the day is, what should Ms. Smith do? And I'm not telling you what she should do right now. I mean, as you can see in a case like this, it's kind of a long process of learning different things as you go along the way and talking to different people. But eventually, she might have to decide whether she's going to bring up a misconduct allegation against her supervisor. And I always encourage people. I'm strongly supportive of ethics and science, and saying, you should really bring up, if there is suspected misconduct, you should not hesitate to go forward if you strongly suspect it. However, I do realize that for doing that can be at great personal expense to somebody. It's going to be could be a lot of hassle. Could be you could get in trouble. If there are not adequate protections for whistleblowers, even if there are, if your boss is fired by the university, you could lose your supervisor, you could lose your funding. So, making an allegation of misconduct against someone is a very serious thing. So you have to think about this carefully. And I'm not saying don't do it, but I know a lot of people are going to be thinking about all the pros and cons on different sides of this about what they should do. Okay, here's another case to look at. Dealing with outliers. So Dr. J is a postdoctoral fellow working with Dr. Q, a principal investigator. They have been performing experiments on a relationship between chemical X, Y, and Z and its binding to an estrogen receptor. Data from the binding experiments fit a neat curve except for a few outliers at the bottom of the scatter plot. Dr. J is wondering how to analyze and present the data shown in the scatter plot. So you can see there's a nice relationship here between the binding, the chemical concentration of the chemical and the binding. But then you have these data points down at the bottom where something doesn't seem to be going right. So what should Jay do? Well, obviously you can go through and you try to get all what we talked about, gathering information, looking about what's going on here. But let's just look at some different options. Delete the data points from the bottom of the scatter plot as outliers because something probably went wrong with the experiment, human or technical error at these data points. Well, that's not the right thing to do. That would be data falsification unless you have information that something actually did go wrong, right? So if you get some information and find out that something went wrong with these data points, then that would be something that you could do. Of course, that might be something also that you report in the paper, that some of these data were deleted because of a problem with the experimental execution of the experiment. Report all the data, but analyze the results without the bottom points. That would be an option you could do. That would be being open and honest with your data. And you could do the analysis and say, look, we omitted some of the outliers, but the data are available to us. The data are available to you if you want to look at all the data, but we excluded some outliers for the purposes of analysis. Repeat the experiments to determine whether similar results are obtained. That is also another good thing, a possible option here. It's always a good idea, to repeat experiments. That's never a bad thing. But the reality is you may not have time or money to do this, right? So that seems like it would be a good thing to do, but not, always practical. And discuss the issue with Dr. Q and other members of the research team. Well, that obviously seems like a good thing to do because, just let everybody know what's going on. Okay, so let's look at another case here to think about, what the ethical thing to do is. Dr. Smith is preparing a manuscript for submission to a prominent journal and is trying to decide the best way to present her image and gel data. Smith comes to you for advice about the following potential figures. He complains the best fluorescence images for a protein called excitin often have an unexplained bright blob of material that looks like junk and will be distracting to readers. Smith debates about what to do. So here's what the options are. So on the left, you see the original image with the junk. Then you see it covered up with an inset, fixed with Photoshop, and then just crop it out. So what is the best reporting image practice for reporting images? Would any of these be deceptive or constitute data fabrication or falsification? Well, fixing it up with Photoshop would clearly be deceptive and would probably even be fabrication or falsification. You're hiding something. You're making something look like it's, you're interfering with the data this way. Covering up with inset, similarly, not really the best way to do it, and it's just looks very sloppy. Leaving it, not a bad idea at all, but the journal might have some questions about, your image, and maybe they want a better image and things like that. Now, cropping it out is an option. That's kind of like the option of, analyzing the data when you have data points, excluding some outliers. In fact, most microscopy images you see, they're always crops. You crop it in a certain way. So you could crop it and you could say the full image is available, supplemental material for the reader. The only trouble with cropping it out is, what if it turns out that this blob is something real? Like it's not a artifact of the microscopy technology or whatever. Then you failed to report something useful that could be useful for other scientists. So before you do something like crop it out, you want to do some studies to make sure this is not real. Maybe you could take the image in different machines, see if you can reproduce it. That way, if it's something that's not consistently reproducible, and that suggests that it's not real, it's something going on with the technology. Okay. Another case we'll look at is an authorship case. So here are the guidelines for authorship adopted by most biomedical journals. And these are from the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors. So to be an author, you need to meet the following: substantial contributions to the conception and design of the work, or the acquisition, analysis, and interpretation of data for the work, and drafting the work or revising it critically for important intellectual content, and final approval of the version to be published, and agreement to be accountable for all aspects of the work in ensuring that questions are related to the accuracy or integrity of any part of the work are appropriately investigated and resolved. So here's our case. Ms. Scott is a graduate student who worked in the lab of Dr. Jones for a year, studying a novel transmembrane protein found only in tumor cells. She isolated some of the protein and developed a sensitive rabbit antibody that recognizes an extracellular portion of the protein. Her dissertation project was going to involve using this antibody along with other methods to study the protein and its potential role in tumor growth and metastasis. She was also working closely with Dr. Watson, a postdoctoral fellow in the lab, who helped her design her project. Despite making progress, she unfortunately did not get along well with Dr. Jones, who was her advisor for the project, and decided to leave the lab for another lab to begin a new project. Okay, let's see. A few months later, Ms. Smith finds out from her new advisor, Dr. Kumar, that Dr. Jones is preparing a paper based on subsequent research conducted by another student, Mr. Blackwell, but using another antibody that she developed. Ms. Scott feels she should be a co-author on the paper and brings this up with Dr. Jones. Dr. Jones explains that the data being published were obtained solely by Mr. Blackwell, and that raising an antibody is merely a technical activity that does not justify co-authorship. Ms. Smith argues that isolation of the protein and the decision about which peptide to select as antigen constitute original scientific thinking. Dr. Jones disagrees, saying the literature contains numerous examples of this type of work, but that she will be mentioned in the acknowledgments. Dr. Watson, who's his postdoc, overhears the conversation, does not get involved in the dispute. Should Ms. Scott be a co-author on the paper? That's like the main question here. Well, I think answering this depends on some facts about the case that would need to be explored further. Okay. What was involved in isolating in the protein and developing this sensitive rabbit antibody to test for a portion of the protein? Did this involve original scientific work, scientific thinking to do this? Or was it merely a technical activity where she was just basically maybe following a recipe developed by someone else? So if it did involve like this original work, that would seem to be in favor of her being an author on the paper. So I think at to really make some headway on something like this, you need to be an expert in the field. You need to know exactly what was being done, making all those factual determinations. What could Ms. Scott and her advisor have done prior to departure to prevent this disagreement from occurring? So this is a common thing. People don't stay in one place often for their whole career, especially students. You're going to move on, right? And so you have to address questions about what happens with the research you've been working on, when you leave. So this is what should have been done. There should have been discussions, maybe agreements, maybe some things put in writing, saying what would happen with her data and what would she be in any publications, how she could be contacted in the future, and so on. Would your answers be any different if Ms. Scott had remained in the original lab but abandoned the project? Probably it shouldn't make any difference, but as a personal matter, it probably would, because then they would be getting along better and he probably wouldn't have taken her off the paper. Would your answers be any different if Ms. Scott were a technician in the lab instead of a graduate student? Again, they shouldn't be different. I think being an author on a paper is a matter of what you do, not who you are or what your position is. But unfortunately, as a matter of just the way things work in science, a lot of times technicians often do not get proper credit on projects because people think, well, you're getting paid for this work and you don't really need an authorship on a paper and so on. But I don't think that's a good attitude to take. I think they should be, if they do something that warrants authorship, they should receive credit. Okay. The last case I want to look at is something that's been in the news and not a lot since the COVID-19 pandemic. So in 2015, a research team led by Ralph Barrick at the University of North Carolina published a paper in Nature Medicine reporting the results of an experiment in which they used a mouse-adapted SARS-CoV backbone to create a chimeric virus that expresses a spike protein of SHCO14. The virus was able to use angiotensin converting enzyme 2, ACE2 receptors to infect and replicate in human airway cells and caused pathogenesis in humanized mice. The authors hypothesized that coronavirus pools found in horseshoe bats maintain spike proteins that give them the capability of infecting humans, and stated that there is a potential risk of SARS-CoV reemergence from viruses currently circulating in bat populations. Barrick's research was funded by NIH. Shi Zhengli, the second to last author on the paper, provided the genomic sequence for the spike protein. She conducted similar NIH-funded experiments at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Barrick's lab was a biosafety level 3, but Shi's was only biosafety level 2. So if you're not familiar with biosafety levels, these are different sort of procedures that we can take to control dangerous biological materials like pathogens and toxins and things like that, to keep them from accidentally contaminating people in the lab and then maybe contaminating the rest of the human population. So you can see the different levels on the different things you do, ranging from just washing surfaces to using biosafety cabinets, airflows that for controlled airflow, sealed windows, filtered ventilation systems. That's biosafety level 3. And then 4 gets even much more, there's even more safety that's applied, wearing full body suits and things like that to do the work. You have that for something like Ebola. So, it's basic ethical questions. What are the benefits and risks of this research? Well, the benefits are to learn more about these viruses and learn how they can evolve in nature and what might happen in the future if they could become more dangerous, if they could infect human beings, things like that, to stay ahead of the viruses. And maybe that will help you to develop vaccines and treatments in the future if to have this better understanding of the virus. But there are risks. The risks that this research could escape, the virus could escape, could infect people, could, get into the human population, possibly cause a pandemic. That's a major risk. And that's why something like looking at biosafety is so important for doing research like this. There's also the risk of bioweapons, that someone could turn this into a weapon, right? And that would be, thinking, maybe we shouldn't publish it or whatever if we think someone could turn it into a weapon. And so after those basic ethical questions, you get into questions about more details, like whether this should have been funded, whether it should be published, if it should be published in full or redacted in some form if you publish something like this, so you wouldn't be able to show people how to make a bioweapon. And so what additional information you need? Well, you really need a lot of more information about how dangerous this stuff is. What are the appropriate biosafety procedures to use for this kind of research? What are the potential benefits that you could get from this? And also, can you do good research like this without actually making something dangerous? Maybe it's possible to get the knowledge you want by, say, computer modeling or studying different parts of the virus, like the proteins and the DNA and RNA, without actually making the whole virus. What ethical principles or values might be in conflict? Well, you have things like, if you go way back to that list I said, there's things like freedom of science, freedom of inquiry. That's important. But you also have concerns about social responsibility, right? And you want to advance science too, but you have to be concerned about your social responsibilities and potential benefits and harms to society, and how you weigh those things. Now, in terms of promoting ethical decision-making, I won't say a whole lot of things about that, but I will say that these are some of the things that people do to promote ethical decision-making. Mentoring, education, and training, which this is part of what you're doing today. But of course, mentoring is something a lot more than just education and training. That's when you're, working with someone day to day, having discussions, showing them how to do research and so on. Policy development. I mentioned some of the important policies that need to be developed to provide people with guidance. Resources for getting advice and support. It's very important. At my institute, I am a bioethicist, and people can come to me when they have questions about, ethical questions and things like that, whether it's misconduct or maybe it's just a authorship dispute, or they're not getting along, they're having some other kinds of issues in the lab that are affecting their research. They can come to me to get advice and support. There's other people too, but I think that's very important for people to be able to get this before things get worse and get out of hand, to where, someone is doing something illegal or unethical, or something else is going on very bad. Compliance and oversight. You need committees that enforce the rules, that investigate misconduct and other things when they happen. Whistleblower protections, I mentioned that, people need to be protected from reprisal if they report something. Auditing of data and research. This is something that's not done a lot. It's done in private industry, but not so much in academia. But I think auditing can catch a lot of problems before they get out of hand. Certainly, I know it is something that we do a lot in human subjects research, to audit, what's going on there. And then leadership is very important. You had earlier today, you had a leader from your institution talking about ethics. And so that kind of support for ethics is very important, because it affects everyone throughout the organizations by telling people what the organization stands for. So I'm going to stop now, and I don't know if there's time for questions or general discussion, but I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing. Thank you.